The crystal champagne flutes crashed to the marble floor of the Belmont Estate ballroom as my cousin Cassian Veylor finished his toast. And here's to Vera, our family's, well, let's call her the struggling one who still believes in fairy tales. The laughter that followed felt like glass shards against my skin. What my family didn't know was that I'd been quietly building a tech consulting empire while they thought I was barely keeping my head above water. They had no idea that the struggling woman in the corner booth had just closed a 7-figure acquisition deal that morning. By the time the evening was over, I'd bought out the entire open bar, taken control of the family's investment portfolio, and left Cassian scrambling to explain to 300 wedding guests why the woman he'd just humiliated was now the one writing the checks. Sometimes the best revenge is served with premium top-shelf liquor and a balance sheet they never saw coming. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The late afternoon sun streamed through the towering windows of Belmont Estate, casting golden light across the Italian marble floors of what was easily the most expensive wedding venue in the tri-state area. Crystal chandeliers hung from coffered ceilings like frozen waterfalls, and every surface gleamed with the kind of perfection that only unlimited budgets could buy. I stood near the ornate mahogany bar, nursing a glass of champagne that probably cost more than most people's monthly grocery bills, watching my family move through the crowd like they owned the world. In many ways, they did. The Siltron name carried weight in financial circles, real estate empires, and political connections that stretched from City Hall to Capitol Hill. My cousin Cassian Veylor held court near the grand staircase, his perfectly tailored tuxedo catching the light as he gestured animatedly to a circle of admirers. At 28, he'd already taken over as CEO of Veylor Holdings, the family's flagship investment firm. His laugh carried across the ballroom, confident and commanding, the sound of someone who'd never questioned their place in the world. The bride, my younger cousin Lyra Asheville, looked radiant in her custom Vera Wang gown, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. Planning a wedding under the Siltron family microscope was like performing surgery in a fishbowl while critics took notes. Every detail had been scrutinized, every vendor vetted through family connections, every guest list decision debated at Sunday dinners for months. "Vera, there you are." My Aunt Joanne Hayes appeared beside me, her silk dress rustling as she leaned, inconspiratorially. "I was wondering if you'd actually show up. Cassian said you might not have anything appropriate to wear." I smoothed my black cocktail dress, a simple but elegant piece I'd bought at a boutique in Manhattan. It wasn't couture, but it fit perfectly and made me feel confident. I managed to find something suitable. Joanne's smile was thin, the kind that never reached the eyes. "Of course you did. You've always been so resourceful." The way she said it made resourcefulness sound like a character flaw, something scrappy people did when they couldn't afford better options. Across the room, Uncle Adrian Vosler was deep in conversation with two men I recognized from financial news programs. Adrian had built his fortune in commercial real estate, transforming entire city blocks into gleaming office towers and luxury residential complexes. His handshake could close million-dollar deals, and his approval could make or break careers in the construction industry. "The ceremony was beautiful," I said to Joanne, trying to steer the conversation toward safer ground. "Oh yes, Lyra spared no expense. Though I suppose when you have the family backing, expense isn't really a concern." She paused meaningfully. "Not everyone has that luxury, of course." I took another sip of champagne, letting the bubbles buy me time to craft a response. Joanne had always possessed a talent for embedding criticism in casual observations, like hiding poison in honey. She'd perfected the art during my teenage years, when every family gathering became an opportunity to comment on my thrift store, clothes, or my mother's secondhand car. The crowd began shifting toward the center of the ballroom as the band finished their instrumental set. A server appeared with a silver tray, collecting empty glasses and replacing them with fresh champagne for the toasts. The crystal caught the chandelier light, creating tiny rainbows on the white linen tablecloths. Cassian moved to the microphone with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to commanding attention. His presence filled the space, drawing every eye in the room. Even the catering staff paused in their work to listen. This was his element, the spotlight where he thrived and where others wilted under the intensity of his charm. "Friends, family, and distinguished guests," he began, his voice carrying effortlessly across the ballroom. "We're gathered here tonight to celebrate not just a wedding, but the joining of two incredible people who represent the best of what our family stands for." Applause rippled through the crowd. I noticed how Cassian's gaze swept across the room, making brief eye contact with key figures like a politician working a town hall meeting. He had a gift for making everyone feel included, while simultaneously reminding them of the hierarchy. "Lyra has always been our family's bright star," he continued, raising his glass toward the bride. "Beautiful, accomplished, and blessed with the wisdom to choose a partner who complements her perfectly. They're building something wonderful together, something that will last." More applause, warmer this time. I found myself genuinely smiling at the sweet sentiment, remembering the awkward teenager Lyra had been who collected vintage books and wrote poetry in hidden notebooks. But then Cassian's expression shifted, taking on the indulgent look adults wear when they're about to make gentle fun of someone they consider harmless. His eyes found mine across the crowded room, and my stomach tightened with a familiar dread. "Of course, not everyone in our family has been quite as fortunate in their pursuits," he said, the microphone amplifying his words to every corner of the ballroom. "Take my dear cousin Vera, for instance. She's been working so hard on her little technology projects, trying to make something of herself in that complicated digital world." The crowd's attention shifted toward me like a searchlight. Conversations paused. Servers slowed their movements. I felt 300 pairs of eyes cataloging my dress, my jewelry, my carefully controlled expression. "Vera represents something important in our family," Cassian continued, his tone taking on the patronizing warmth reserved for beloved but misguided relatives. "She reminds us that not everyone needs to achieve conventional success to have value. Sometimes it's enough to simply keep trying, to keep believing in those entrepreneurial dreams even when they don't quite pan out." A few nervous chuckles scattered through the crowd. I gripped my champagne flute tighter, feeling the crystal's sharp edges against my palm. "So let's raise our glasses not just to Lyra and her husband, but to all the dreamers in our family." 2. Those who teach us that persistence has its own reward, even when the results aren't quite what we might hope for. He lifted his champagne high, his smile brilliant and devastating. "Here's to Vera, our family's eternal optimist, the one who keeps believing in fairy tales even when the rest of us have learned to be more practical." The toast hit the room like a physical force. Some guests raised their glasses enthusiastically, caught up in Cassian's charismatic delivery. Others hesitated, sensing the underlying cruelty but uncertain how to respond. A few whispered comments floated through the air, just loud enough for me to catch fragments. "Poor thing. Still trying to make it work. At least she keeps trying. Bless her heart, she never gives up." The sound of crystal touching crystal filled the ballroom as 300 guests participated in what felt less like a celebration and more like a public execution. I raised my own glass mechanically, the smile frozen on my face as years of family conditioning kicked in. Don't make a scene. Don't embarrass the family. Don't let them see they've drawn blood. Cassian's eyes met mine across the room, and for just a moment, his mask slipped. I saw the calculation behind the charm, the deliberate cruelty dressed up as affectionate teasing. He'd planned this moment, crafted it to inflict maximum damage while maintaining plausible deniability. After all, he'd never said anything technically untrue or overtly hostile. He'd simply positioned me as the family's beloved failure, the Cautionary tale everyone could feel superior to while still claiming to care about me. The applause continued, washing over me like acid rain. I nodded graciously, playing the part I'd been assigned, while inside, something fundamental shifted. The last thread of familial loyalty, worn thin by years of condescension and casual cruelty, finally snapped. As the crowd returned to their conversations and the band resumed playing, I made my way toward the terrace doors. The evening air would give me space to breathe, to think, to plan. Because what Cassian and the rest of my family didn't know was that while they'd been assuming I was struggling with my little technology projects, I'd actually built something extraordinary. The phone in my purse contained confirmation of an acquisition deal I'd closed that morning, a transaction that would triple my company's valuation overnight. The struggling entrepreneur they'd just publicly humiliated was now worth more than most of them combined, but they'd learn that soon enough. The marble terrace of Belmont Estate overlooked manicured gardens that probably employed more groundskeepers than most companies had employees. I stood at the ornate balustrade, letting the cool evening air wash away the lingering sting of public humiliation. The sounds of the reception continued behind me, muffled by the heavy glass doors, while I tried to process what had just happened. My phone buzzed against my palm. The screen showed a text from an unknown number. "We need to talk about Siltron Industries. Tonight. It's urgent." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I stared at the message, my pulse quickening. Siltron Industries was the family's main holding company, the umbrella organization that controlled everything from Cassian's investment firm to Uncle Adrian's real estate empire. More importantly, it was the entity that held my trust fund, the inheritance from my father that was supposed to be mine when I turned 30. That birthday was next month. Before I could respond, the terrace doors opened behind me. I turned, expecting to see another guest stepping out for air, but instead found Elena Draycott, a woman I recognized but had never actually met. She was in her 40s, impeccably dressed in a navy suit that suggested she'd come straight from a boardroom rather than attending as a wedding guest. "Ms. Siltron," she said, her voice crisp and professional. "I'm Elena Draycott, senior partner at Draycott & Associates. I represent several clients who have business relationships with your family's companies. I'm sorry, but this is my cousin's wedding. If you need to discuss business matters, perhaps you could call my office on Monday." Elena's expression remained serious. "I'm afraid this can't wait. What I'm about to tell you directly affects your financial future, and time is a critical factor." She pulled a manila folder from her briefcase and handed it to me. "These are documents filed with the State Corporation Commission 3 days ago. I think you'll find them illuminating." I opened the folder, squinting at the legal text in the dim terrace lighting. The papers appeared to be some kind of corporate restructuring agreement, filled with dense legal language that would require careful study to understand fully. "The summary is this," Elena said, watching my face as I skimmed the documents. "Your cousin Cassian has orchestrated a reorganization of Siltron Industries that effectively removes your trust fund from the family holding structure. Instead of receiving your inheritance directly, you'll receive shares in a subsidiary company that he controls." My hands went cold despite the warm evening air. "That's not possible. The trust documents are ironclad. My father's lawyers made sure of that before he died." "Your father's lawyers drafted those documents 15 years ago," Elena replied. "Corporate law has evolved considerably since then, and there are loopholes that didn't exist when the original trust was established. Cassian has exploited those loopholes very cleverly." I flipped through the pages, recognizing some of the signatures. At the bottom, Uncle Adrian's bold scrawl, Aunt Joanne's precise cursive. Even Lyra's new husband had signed, though I doubted he understood what he was endorsing on his wedding day. "They all knew about this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The restructuring required approval from all major shareholders in the family companies. Everyone signed except you, which is why the documents were filed now, while you were presumably distracted by wedding festivities. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. While I'd been listening to Cassian's public humiliation disguised as a toast he'd already legally maneuvered to strip away my financial independence, the timing wasn't coincidental. He'd planned the corporate coup to coincide with the wedding, knowing I'd be focused on family obligations rather than monitoring business filings. "How much are we talking about?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know the answer. "Your original trust was worth approximately $12 million, Elena said matter-of-factly. "Under the new structure, you'll receive shares worth roughly $2 million, and those shares carry no voting rights. Essentially, you'll be paid dividends at Cassian's discretion, but you'll have no control over the underlying assets." $10 million. He'd stolen $10 million from me while making jokes about my entrepreneurial dreams in front of 300 people. The sheer audacity was breathtaking. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "What's your interest in my family's internal business?" Elena's smile was thin but not unkind. "Let's just say that Cassian's methods have created enemies, and some of those enemies have resources. You're not the first family member he's maneuvered against, and you won't be the last unless someone stops him." She handed me a business card. "I specialize in corporate restructuring and family wealth disputes. If you decide you want to fight this, call me, but don't wait too long. Once the 30-day filing period expires, challenging the restructuring becomes much more difficult." As Elena disappeared back into the reception, I remained on the terrace, staring at the documents in my hands. The legal language was dense, but the implications were clear. Cassian had systematically undermined my financial future while positioning himself as the benevolent family patriarch, making tough decisions for everyone's benefit. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from my assistant. "The Northfield acquisition closed successfully. Final paperwork signed at 4 p.m. Congratulations, you now own a $50 million company." The irony was almost funny. While my family was stealing my inheritance, I'd just completed the largest business deal of my career. The technology consulting firm I'd built from nothing had acquired a major competitor, instantly transforming my company into one of the region's dominant players in enterprise software solutions. I scrolled through my phone, looking at bank notifications and wire confirmations from throughout the day. My liquid assets alone were approaching 8 figures, not counting the value of my company or my real estate investments. The struggling entrepreneur Cassian had mocked was worth more than I realized, and I'd built it all without using a penny of family money. But that wasn't the point. The trust fund represented more than money. It was my father's final gift, his way of ensuring I'd always have security and independence. Cassian had stolen that legacy while making jokes about my competence, and he'd enlisted the entire family as accomplices. I walked back toward the reception, my mind racing. Through the glass doors, I could see Cassian holding court near the band, regaling a group of admirers with some anecdote that had them laughing appreciatively. His wife, a petite blonde who looked like she'd stepped from a society magazine, hung on his arm with practiced devotion. Uncle Adrian was deep in conversation with several men I didn't recognize, probably discussing his latest development project. Aunt Joanne fluttered between groups like a social butterfly, spreading gossip and collecting information with equal enthusiasm. They all looked so comfortable, so secure in their assumption that I'd simply accept whatever they decided was best for me. The struggling relative who needed their guidance and protection, too naive to understand complex financial matters. I pulled out my phone and called my own attorney, Leander Corvin, a sharp-minded lawyer who'd helped structure several of my business deals. "Leander, it's Vera. I need you to look into something immediately, and it can't wait until Monday." "What's the situation?" he asked, his tone shifting to full professional mode. "My family has just executed a corporate restructuring that appears to have diverted my trust fund. I'm sending you documents now, and I need to know exactly what my legal options are." How urgent are we talking? I looked through the glass doors at Cassian, still laughing with his admirers, completely confident in his victory. Extremely urgent. I want to know every possible way to challenge this, and I want to know by tomorrow morning. I'll have my team review the documents tonight, Leander promised. And Vera, don't sign anything else until we talk. As I ended the call, a plan began forming in my mind. Cassian had made one crucial error in his calculation. He'd assumed I was as financially vulnerable as the rest of the family believed. He'd structured his coup around the premise that I needed the trust fund money, that losing it would force me into a dependent position where I'd have to accept whatever terms he offered. He had no idea that I'd spent the last 5 years building something that made his theft irrelevant from a practical standpoint. But it wasn't irrelevant from an emotional standpoint, and it certainly wasn't irrelevant from a legal standpoint. I walked back into the reception, my expression calm and controlled. A few guests smiled at me sympathetically, probably assuming I was still processing Cassian's affectionate toast. If only they knew what was really running through my mind. The band struck up a waltz, and couples moved onto the dance floor. Lyra looked radiant in her husband's arms, spinning across the marble in a cloud of white silk. For her sake, I hoped she'd remain blissfully unaware of the corporate machinations her wedding had provided cover for. Cassian caught my eye from across the room and raised his glass in a mock toast, his smile sharp and satisfied. He thought he'd won, that his public humiliation followed by private financial theft had put me permanently in my place. Tomorrow, he'd begin learning how wrong he was. The law offices of Corvin and Associates occupied 3 floors of a glass tower in the financial district, the kind of building where million-dollar decisions were made over handshake agreements and contracts that could reshape entire industries. I arrived at 7 a.m., 2 hours before normal business hours, carrying a box of documents and a determination that had kept me awake most of the night. Leander Corvin was already waiting, his usually perfect appearance slightly rumpled from an all-night document review session. Coffee stains marked his shirt cuffs, and his desk was covered with legal briefs, corporate filings, and printouts that looked like they'd been highlighted by a rainbow. "I've got good news and bad news," he said without preamble. "The good news is that the restructuring has several vulnerabilities we can exploit. The bad news is that your cousin is smarter than I gave him credit for, and this isn't his first time manipulating family corporate structures." He handed me a thick folder. We pulled public records on all the Siltron family entities going back 10 years. This trust fund theft isn't an isolated incident. It's part of a pattern. I opened the folder and began reading. The first document was a corporate filing from 3 years ago involving my cousin Adrian Vosler, Uncle Adrian's younger son who'd supposedly decided to pursue a career in art rather than the family business. According to these records, Adrian had originally been slated to inherit a controlling stake in several of his father's real estate ventures. Those stakes had been restructured into non-voting preferred shares just before Adrian's 25th birthday. Adrian never got control of his inheritance either? I asked. Not only that, but 6 months after the restructuring, he started receiving regular payments from Cassian's investment firm. Officially, they're consulting fees for providing artistic direction on commercial development projects. Unofficially, they look like hush money to keep Adrian quiet about losing his voting rights. The next document detailed a similar maneuver involving my cousin Kyla Veral, Aunt Joanne's daughter. Kyla had been promised a partnership stake in the family's hospitality investments when she graduated from business school. Instead, she'd received a management position with a generous salary but no equity ownership. Her business school transcripts showed she'd been on the dean's list, hardly the profile of someone incapable of handling complex financial responsibilities. "How many family members has he done this to?" I asked, though I was starting to suspect the answer would be depressing. "Everyone under 35 who stood to inherit significant assets," Leander replied. "He's systematically consolidated control by convincing older family members that the younger generation lacks the maturity to handle serious wealth." Then he's bought silence with generous salaries and consulting arrangements that keep everyone comfortable but powerless. I flipped through more documents, recognizing names and faces from family gatherings over the years. Cousins who'd seemed perfectly content with their roles in various family businesses, never mentioning that they'd been maneuvered out of their rightful ownership stakes. The monthly payments from Cassian's firms were substantial enough to maintain upper-class lifestyles, but not substantial enough to provide true independence. It's brilliant in a sociopathic way, I admitted. He's created a system where everyone thinks they're being taken care of, but he's the only one with real power. There's more, Leander said, pulling out another set of documents. These are the original trust documents your father created. Look at the succession clauses. I studied the legal language, searching for the relevant sections. I don't see anything unusual. Standard provisions for asset distribution upon reaching age 30. Look at Section 12, subsection 4. Leander pointed to a paragraph buried in the middle of the document. Your father included a clause that allows the trust to be restructured if the beneficiary demonstrates financial incompetence or becomes a burden to the family's business interests. My stomach dropped. And Cassian is claiming I've demonstrated financial incompetence? Not exactly. He's claiming that your technology ventures represent a potential liability to the family's reputation and financial stability. The argument is that your business activities could expose the family to lawsuits or regulatory scrutiny, so removing the trust from your direct control protects everyone's interests. The accusation was absurd. My technology consulting firm was entirely legitimate, focused on helping established companies optimize their digital infrastructure. We'd never been involved in any regulatory issues or legal disputes. But I could see how Cassian might have convinced elderly family members that the technology industry was inherently risky and unpredictable. He's been building this case for months, I realized aloud. The comments at family dinners about my complicated business, the questions about whether I understood the legal implications of my contract, the suggestion that I might be taking unnecessary risks. Leander nodded. Classic manipulation. He planted seeds of doubt about your competence, then harvested them when he needed justification for the restructuring. I thought back to recent family gatherings, remembering conversations I'd dismissed as typical older generation skepticism about technology companies. Uncle Adrian asking whether my clients might sue if their systems were hacked. Aunt Joanne wondering whether I carried enough insurance to protect myself from liability. Cassian himself suggesting that my rapid business growth might attract unwanted attention from competitors or regulators. At the time, I'd appreciated what seemed like genuine concern for my welfare. Now I understood it had been reconnaissance, gathering information that could be used to construct an argument for my financial incompetence. There's something else you should know, Leander said, his expression growing more serious. We found records indicating that Cassian has been quietly accumulating debt in several of the family entities. The investment firm is leveraged far beyond what public filings suggest, and some of his real estate ventures are on shaky financial ground. He showed me an analysis his team had compiled, tracking money flows between various Siltran family companies. The pattern was complex but clear. Cassian had been using his control over family assets to prop up his failing investments, essentially gambling with money that belonged to other family members. He needs the trust funds and inheritance stakes to cover his losses, I said, understanding the full scope of his desperation. This isn't just about power. He's financially underwater and using family money to stay afloat. That's our assessment. The restructuring that diverted your trust fund also provided him with access to liquidity he couldn't obtain through normal banking channels. Your $12 million is probably already committed to covering margin calls and loan payments. The revelation transformed my anger into something colder and more calculating. This wasn't just theft. It was a Ponzi scheme using family wealth as collateral. Cassian had positioned himself as the successful patriarch while secretly cannibalizing the financial security of everyone who trusted him. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. The caller ID showed Elena Draycott, the lawyer who'd approached me at the wedding. "Ms. Siltron, I hope I'm not calling too early," she said. "I wanted to follow up on our conversation last night. Have you had a chance to review the documents I provided? I'm reviewing them now with my attorney, but I have some questions about your involvement in this situation." Of course. I represent a group of investors who've had significant exposure to Cassian's various ventures. We've been monitoring the family corporate structures because our clients' returns are directly affected by the stability of Siltron Industries. I looked at Leander, who was listening intently to my side of the conversation. "What kind of investors?" "Pension funds, primarily. Municipal employee retirement systems that invested in several of your cousin's real estate projects. If those projects fail because of cash flow problems, it could affect retirement benefits for thousands of people." The scope of potential damage was staggering. Cassian's financial gambling wasn't just affecting family members. It was threatening the retirement security of teachers, firefighters, and other public employees who'd trusted their pension funds to professional managers. "We're prepared to provide additional information that might be helpful in challenging the trust restructuring," Elena continued. "Information that your family might not want to become public record." I understood the implication. Elena's clients had been conducting their own investigation into Cassian's business practices, and they'd uncovered evidence that could expose him to regulatory scrutiny or criminal prosecution. They were offering to share that evidence in exchange for my help in stabilizing the family's financial structure. "I'll call you back," I said, ending the conversation. Leander was already making notes on a legal pad. "This is bigger than a family dispute," he said. "If pension funds are involved and there's potential fraud, we could be looking at federal investigations. I stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the city beginning to wake up for another day of business. 3 floors below, early commuters were walking to their jobs, trusting that their paychecks and retirement savings were being managed responsibly by people like my cousin. Cassian had built his empire on that trust, and now he was betraying everyone who'd believed in him. The wedding toast that had humiliated me was nothing compared to the damage he was inflicting on people who couldn't fight back. "What do you need from me to build a case?" I asked. Leander smiled grimly. "Everything you can get your hands on. Financial records, corporate communications, anything that shows the pattern of manipulation. And we need to move fast. The longer this restructuring stays in place, the harder it becomes to unwind." I pulled out my phone and started making calls. If Cassian wanted to play corporate warfare using family relationships as weapons, he'd picked the wrong opponent. Unlike the other relatives he'd manipulated, I had resources he knew nothing about and allies he'd never considered. The game was about to change, and this time I'd be setting the rules. The financial district hummed with activity as I walked toward the offices of North Point Capital Management, the investment firm that had just become my most recent acquisition target. The morning air carried the energy of 1,000 deals being made, contracts being signed, and fortunes being won or lost with the stroke of a pen. My phone had been buzzing constantly since my meeting with Leander, each notification bringing new intelligence about Cassian's increasingly desperate financial situation. The picture emerging was far worse than even Elena Draycott had suggested during our initial conversation. Inside the North Point building, I took the elevator to the 32nd floor, where Matthias Draylen was waiting in a conference room that overlooked the harbor. Matthias was a forensic accountant who specialized in untangling complex corporate fraud schemes, and his reputation for discretion made him invaluable when dealing with sensitive family matters. "The numbers don't lie," he said without preamble, spreading a series of financial analyses across the polished conference table. "Your cousin has been running a shell game with family assets for at least 3 years, maybe longer." The documents painted a picture of systematic financial mismanagement disguised as aggressive investment strategy. Cassian had leveraged family companies to secure loans that funded increasingly risky ventures, from speculative real estate developments to high-tech startups with no clear path to profitability. Look at this, Matthias pointed to a cash flow analysis. Veylor Holdings has been borrowing against future returns from investments that haven't actually generated any returns. The money has been cycling through various family entities to create the appearance of diverse revenue streams, but it's all the same cash being moved around. I studied the chart, following the money trail through a maze of subsidiary companies and holding entities. How much total exposure are we talking about? Conservative estimate? 40 million in leveraged debt across all family entities. Worst case scenario. If the leveraged investments fail to perform, it could be closer to 60 million. The scale was breathtaking. Cassian had mortgaged the entire family's wealth to fund his ambitious expansion plans, and those plans were failing. Catastrophically, the trust fund restructuring wasn't just theft. It was a desperate attempt to access liquid capital that could keep his financial house of cards from collapsing. There's something else, Matthias continued, pulling out another set of documents. Several of the pension fund investments Elena mentioned are showing signs of serious distress. The municipal employee retirement systems invested in 3 separate real estate development projects, and all 3 are behind schedule with cost. Overruns approaching 30%. He showed me photographs of construction sites in various states of completion. One project, a luxury residential tower in the financial district, appeared to be completely stalled, with construction equipment sitting idle and the building's steel framework exposed to the elements. The contractors haven't been paid in 6 weeks, Matthias explained. The city has issued stop work orders on 2 of the projects due to safety violations, and there are liens filed against all 3 properties. I leaned back in my chair, absorbing the implications. Thousands of public employees had trusted their retirement savings to professional managers who'd invested in Cassian's projects. Those workers had no idea their pensions were funding a Ponzi scheme that could leave them with nothing. What happens when the pension funds realize their investments are worthless? I asked. Federal investigation, criminal charges, probably congressional hearings about pension fund oversight. This isn't just a family business dispute anymore. When public employee pensions are involved, it becomes a matter of public interest. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Coffee? We need to discuss our mutual Cassian problem. Jay. I showed the message to Matthias. Any idea who Jay might be? He studied the phone number. Could be Jonas Merrick. He's been asking questions about Siltron family investments for several weeks, represents some of the institutional investors who are starting to get nervous about their exposure. An hour later, I was sitting in a small cafe near the waterfront, watching a man in his 50s approach my table with the careful gait of someone carrying heavy concerns. Jonas Merrick had the weathered appearance of someone who'd spent decades navigating financial storms, his gray hair and lined face suggesting experience with both triumph and disaster. Ms. Siltron, he said, extending his hand. Thank you for meeting with me on short notice. I represent several institutional investors who have significant exposure to your family's business ventures. He sat down across from me, placing a thin briefcase on the table. I'll be direct. Your cousin has created a situation that threatens to destroy not just your family's wealth, but the retirement security of thousands of people who trusted their money to professional fund managers. I'm beginning to understand the scope of the problem, I replied. But I'm not sure what you expect me to do about it. Jonas opened his briefcase and pulled out a folder. These are internal communications from Cassian's office, obtained through legal discovery processes related to the stalled construction projects. They show that he's been aware of the cash flow problems for months, but has continued soliciting new investments without disclosing the risks. I read through emails that painted a picture of increasingly frantic attempts to maintain appearances while the underlying business reality deteriorated. Cassian had been reassuring investors about project timelines while privately acknowledging to his staff that completion dates were impossible to meet. This is securities fraud, I said. Among other things. Mail fraud, wire fraud, Probably RICO violations given the pattern of behavior across multiple entities. The federal prosecutors are already building a case, but they're missing key pieces of evidence that only someone with family access could provide. Jonas leaned forward, his expression intense. Your cousin has been using family relationships as a shield, assuming that relatives wouldn't expose him to outside scrutiny. The trust fund restructuring was his attempt to buy more time and access, more capital, but it also created a paper trail that prosecutors can follow. He handed me another document. This is a proffer agreement. If you're willing to cooperate with the federal investigation, you'd receive immunity from prosecution for any inadvertent involvement in your family's business activities, plus protection as a whistleblower. The offer was tempting, but I hesitated. What about the other family members? Are they going to be charged as co-conspirators? That depends largely on what we discover about their level of knowledge and involvement. The restructuring documents were signed by several family members, but if they can demonstrate they were misled about the true financial situation, they'd likely be treated as victims rather than perpetrators. I thought about Uncle Adrian, Aunt Joanne, and the other relatives who'd signed the restructuring papers. They'd probably been presented with carefully crafted summaries that emphasized the benefits while obscuring the risks. Cassian had built his career on convincing people to trust him with decisions they didn't fully understand. I need time to consider this, I said. Jonas nodded. I understand. But time is a luxury we may not have much of. The pension fund managers are getting pressure from their boards to liquidate the failing investments and cut their losses. If that happens, it triggers bankruptcy proceedings that could expose everything to public scrutiny. He stood to leave, then paused. There's one more thing you should know. Your cousin has been making inquiries about your own business activities. He's hired a private investigator to look into your technology company's client relationships and financial structure. The revelation sent a chill through me. Why would he do that? Insurance policy, probably. If his scheme unravels, he'll want leverage against family members who might be tempted to cooperate with investigators. Information about your business could be used to implicate you in regulatory violations or create conflicts of interest that would disqualify you as a witness. After Jonas left, I sat in the cafe for another hour, watching harbor traffic and processing the complexity of the situation I'd stumbled into. What had started as outrage over a stolen inheritance had evolved into something far more serious. Cassian wasn't just a greedy relative. He was a criminal whose schemes threatened the financial security of thousands of innocent people. My phone rang. The caller ID showed Leander's office number. Vera, we've got a problem, he said without preamble. Someone broke into your office last night. Nothing appears to be missing, but your filing cabinets were searched and several computer hard drives were copied. The private investigator had already made his move. Cassian was gathering ammunition for whatever battle was coming, and he was prepared to use every weapon at his disposal. What do you want me to do? Leander asked. I looked out at the harbor, watching a container ship navigate toward the port. The ship's captain probably had detailed charts showing every underwater obstacle, every hidden reef that could damage his vessel. I needed similar intelligence about the dangers ahead. Set up a meeting with Elena Draycott and Jonas Merrick, I said. If Cassian wants to play hardball, he's going to learn that some games have consequences he never considered. The time for family loyalty was over. Now it was about justice. The private dining room at Meridian Club occupied a corner of the building's top floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city's financial district. The exclusive venue was known for hosting discreet business meetings where handshake deals worth hundreds of millions were negotiated over perfectly prepared meals, away from the prying eyes of competitors and regulatory agencies. I arrived precisely. At noon, having spent the morning coordinating with Leander to ensure every detail of what we were about to propose would be legally bulletproof. The stakes were too high for improvisation, and Cassian's late-night surveillance of my office had proved he was prepared to fight dirty. Elena Draycott was already seated at the mahogany table, reviewing documents from a leather portfolio that probably contained enough evidence to destroy several careers. Across from her, Jonas Merrick studied a tablet displaying financial charts that tracked the deteriorating performance of Cassian's investments in real time. "The situation has accelerated since our last conversation," Elena said, as I took my seat. "Two more pension funds have demanded immediate liquidation of their positions in Siltron family projects, and the construction lenders are threatening to call their loans within 30 days. Jonas looked up from his tablet. "We're looking at a cascade failure. Once the first domino falls, the rest will follow within weeks. The only question is whether we can control the collapse or let it happen randomly." A fourth person entered the dining room, someone I hadn't expected to see. Kyla Verrill, my cousin and one of Cassian's earlier victims, closed the door behind her with the careful precision of someone who understood the gravity of the conversation she was about to join. "Kyla," I said, standing to embrace her. "I didn't know you were involved in this." She managed a rueful smile. "I've been involved longer than you might think. Jonas reached out to me last week after discovering the pattern of family trust manipulations. Turns out I'm not the only one who's been wondering why my inheritance seemed to evaporate." As we sat down, Kyla pulled out her own folder of documents. "I've been keeping records of every suspicious transaction, every family meeting where Cassian steered conversations toward protecting younger family members from financial responsibility. I started documenting everything 3 years ago when my business school professors told me the partnership structure I described was designed to exclude me from real ownership." Elena leaned forward with interest. "What kind of records?" "Audio. Recordings of family dinners, copies of emails discussing trust restructurings, financial statements showing how my supposed partnership salary was actually funded by borrowing against my original inheritance. I kept everything because I knew someday I'd need proof." Jonas whistled softly. "That's exactly the kind of evidence prosecutors love. Family member testimony backed by contemporaneous documentation." "There are others," Kyla continued. "Adrian has been keeping similar records since his art career mysteriously became so well-funded by family consulting contracts. Lyra's new husband is actually a forensic accountant who's been quietly reviewing family financial statements since their engagement. Even some of the older relatives are starting to ask questions about why family assets keep getting restructured. The scope of potential allies was larger than I'd imagined. Cassian's systematic manipulation had created a network of relatives who'd been harboring suspicions and gathering evidence for years. What looked like family loyalty from the outside was actually an intelligence operation waiting for the right moment to surface. "Here's what we're proposing," Elena said, opening her portfolio to reveal a comprehensive legal strategy. "Coordinated civil and criminal actions that expose the full scope of Cassian's schemes while protecting innocent family members and pension fund beneficiaries." She spread out organizational charts showing the relationships between various Siltron entities and their creditors. "The civil case focuses on reversing the fraudulent trust restructurings and recovering assets that were illegally diverted. The criminal referrals focus on securities fraud and fiduciary violations that affected institutional investors." Jonas added his own analysis. "The key is timing. If we move too slowly, Cassian will have time to hide assets or destroy evidence. If we move too quickly, we risk triggering panic selling that could make the pension fund losses worse." "What about the family members who signed the restructuring documents?" I asked. "Are they going to face criminal exposure?" "That depends on what they knew and when they knew it," Elena replied. "Family members who can demonstrate they were misled about material facts would be treated as victims. Those who knowingly participated in fraudulent schemes would face potential prosecution." Kyla shifted uncomfortably. "My father signed several of the restructuring documents, but I don't think he understood what he was approving. Cassian told him it was routine paperwork to optimize tax efficiency." "We'll need to interview him and review any communications he had with Cassian about the restructurings," Jonas said. If he can demonstrate he relied on misrepresentations, that actually strengthens the fraud case. Elena pulled out another document. There's one more element to consider. The federal investigation has uncovered evidence that Cassian has been moving money offshore, possibly in preparation for fleeing the country if his schemes are exposed. She showed us bank records tracking wire transfers to accounts in countries with strict bank secrecy laws. The transfers accelerated after your wedding confrontation, suggesting he's aware that his control over the family is weakening. The revelation added urgency to our planning. If Cassian succeeded in moving substantial assets offshore, recovering, money for the pension funds and defrauded family members would become exponentially more difficult. How quickly can we move? I asked. Civil restraining orders can be filed within 48 hours, Elena said. Federal criminal charges will take longer, but we can request immediate asset freezes to prevent further transfers. Jonas nodded. The pension fund managers are prepared to file breach of fiduciary duty claims as soon as we give them the signal. Their lawyers have been reviewing the evidence for weeks. I looked around the table at the faces of people who'd committed themselves to stopping Cassian's schemes, despite the personal and professional risks involved. Elena was risking her reputation by taking on a case that would inevitably generate negative publicity for her firm. Jonas was jeopardizing his relationships with other institutional investors who might not appreciate having their decision-making processes scrutinized. Kyla was preparing to testify against her own family member in proceedings that could destroy the Siltron name forever. There's something else I need to tell you, I said. My technology company completed a major acquisition this week. I now have liquid assets that could be used to help stabilize some of the failing investments, at least temporarily. The statement changed the entire dynamic of our conversation. Elena's eyebrows rose. Jonas set down his tablet and focused completely on me. Kyla smiled for the first time since arriving. How liquid? Jonas asked. Enough to cover the immediate obligations of the stalled construction projects and buy time for an orderly liquidation that protects the pension fund investments. Elena leaned back in her chair, reassessing the strategic landscape. That changes everything. Instead of trying to minimize damage from a catastrophic collapse, we could orchestrate a controlled restructuring that protects innocent victims while ensuring Cassian faces appropriate consequences. But it also makes you a target, Kyla warned. If Cassian realizes you have that kind of money, he'll try to manipulate you into bailing him out voluntarily. He'll use every family relationship, every emotional appeal, every guilt trip he can manufacture. I thought about the private investigator who'd broken into my office, the dossier Cassian was probably building about my business activities, the leverage he was accumulating for exactly this kind of situation. He already knows, I said. The office break-in wasn't random. He's been monitoring my company's activities and he probably has a good estimate of my net worth. Jonas nodded grimly. Which means he's going to make you an offer. Some kind of partnership or investment opportunity that would give him access to your capital while maintaining his control over family assets. And if I refuse? He'll try to destroy you, Elena said bluntly. Regulatory complaints, tax audits, whatever legal harassment he can generate to pressure you into compliance. The waiter appeared to take our lunch orders, providing a natural break in the conversation. As we waited for our food, I processed the full scope of what we were planning. Within the next few days, we would initiate legal proceedings that could send my cousin to federal prison, destroy the Siltron family's social standing, and expose financial mismanagement that threatened thousands of retirees. But we would also protect innocent victims, recover stolen assets, and ensure that future generations of family members couldn't be manipulated the way we had been. I'm ready to move forward, I said when the waiter left. Whatever it takes. Kyla reached across the table and squeezed my hand. We're in this together, all of us. Elena opened her briefcase and pulled out a stack of legal documents. Then, let's begin. By this time tomorrow, Cassian Veylor is going to discover that the family members he's been manipulating have some surprises of their own. As we began reviewing the specific legal filings and coordinating our timeline, I felt a sense of anticipation that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with justice. The struggling entrepreneur Cassian had mocked at the wedding was about to show him what real power looked like when it was built on intelligence, integrity, and the determination to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. The game was about to change, and this time the rules would be written by the people he'd underestimated. The federal courthouse in downtown opened its doors at 7 a.m. sharp, and Elena Draycott was waiting in the lobby with a briefcase full of legal documents that would reshape the Siltron family forever. The morning light streamed through the building's tall windows, illuminating the marble floors where thousands of cases had been decided over the decades, some involving millions of dollars and the fate of entire corporations. I watched from across the street as Elena made her way through security, knowing that within the next hour, she would file emergency motions for asset freezes and restraining orders that would lock down every bank account, investment portfolio, and real estate holding controlled by Cassian Veylor, the legal machine we'd set in motion over the past week was about to deliver its first devastating blow. My phone buzzed with a text from Kyla. Adrian's testimony is recorded and sealed. Dad signed the affidavit this morning. We're ready. The coordination had been flawless. While Cassian spent the week following the wedding celebrating what he believed was his final victory over the family's younger generation, we'd been methodically building the most comprehensive corporate fraud case the federal prosecutors had seen in years. Every family member he'd manipulated, every pension fund he'd defrauded, every regulatory violation he'd committed was now documented, cross-referenced, and prepared for presentation to multiple jurisdictions simultaneously. Jonas Merrick emerged from the courthouse steps, checking his phone as he walked toward the financial district. His institutional investor clients had spent the morning liquidating their positions in Siltron-controlled entities, but unlike the panicked selling Cassian expected, this was a coordinated withdrawal designed to maximize recovery while minimizing market disruption. The pension fund managers had been briefed on our strategy and were prepared to support the legal proceedings rather than simply cutting their losses. I drove toward the offices of Corvin and Associates, where Leander was finalizing the civil complaints that would accompany Elena's criminal referrals. The legal strategy required precise timing across multiple jurisdictions, with state corporate fraud charges, federal securities violations, and family court trust disputes all being filed within a 6-hour window to prevent Cassian from playing different courts against each other. The law firm's conference room had been transformed into a war room, with financial charts covering the walls and boxes of evidence stacked on every available surface. Leander looked up from his laptop as I entered, his expression mixing exhaustion with barely contained excitement. The asset freeze orders were granted 20 minutes ago, he said. Every Siltron entity account is now under court supervision. Cassian can't move money, can't write checks, can't even pay his office rent without judicial approval. The speed of the court's response had exceeded our expectations. Federal judges took pension fund fraud seriously, especially when the evidence was as comprehensive as what Elena had presented. The initial court filings included audio recordings of Cassian's lies to investors, bank records showing the movement of diverted trust fund money, and testimony from family members who could prove they'd been systematically deceived about their inheritance rights. What about the offshore accounts? I asked. Treasury Department is handling those through international cooperation treaties, Leander replied. It'll take longer, but the Swiss and Cayman banks have been notified about potential money laundering investigations. Those accounts are effectively frozen too. My phone rang. The caller ID showed Cassian's name, and for a moment I considered letting it go to voicemail. But curiosity won out, and I answered on the 4th ring. Vera, thank God. His voice was strained, lacking the smooth confidence I'd grown up hearing at family gatherings. I need to speak with you immediately. There's been some kind of mistake with the bank accounts, and I think someone is trying to sabotage the family businesses. The performance was masterful, even under pressure. Cassian was framing the legal assault as an external attack on the family rather than consequences for his own actions, probably hoping to rally family loyalty against outside forces. What kind of mistake? I asked, keeping my tone neutral. All the corporate accounts are frozen, the lawyers are saying something about federal investigations, and there are process servers trying to deliver papers to half the family. Someone is targeting us, Vera, and we need to stick together. I could hear the desperation beneath his practiced charm. The man who'd publicly humiliated me less than a week ago was now begging for my support, though he still didn't understand that I was the architect of his destruction, rather than a potential ally against it. Have you talked to Uncle Adrian or Aunt Joanne? I asked. They're not taking my calls, neither is Kyla, and even Lyra's husband is avoiding me. It's like someone has turned the whole family against me. The isolation was intentional. We'd spent the past week reaching out to every family member who'd been affected by Cassian's schemes, providing them with evidence of their victimization, and offering them legal protection in exchange for their cooperation with the investigation. The family members who'd signed restructuring documents under false pretenses were now witnesses rather than co-conspirators, and their testimony would be devastating when the cases went to trial. Maybe you should talk to a lawyer, I suggested. I've got lawyers, but they're saying the evidence against me is overwhelming and I should consider plea negotiations. Plea negotiations, Vera? As if I've committed some kind of crime instead of trying to protect the family's financial interests. The self-deception was remarkable. Even with his empire crumbling around him, Cassian couldn't acknowledge that his protection had actually been systematic theft. He'd constructed such an elaborate justification for his actions that he seemed genuinely confused by the legal consequences. I need to ask you something directly, he said, his voice taking on the manipulative tone I remembered from childhood. Your technology company has been very successful recently. If you could provide some bridge financing to help stabilize the family investments while we sort out this legal confusion, it would save everyone a lot of unnecessary hardship. There it was. The final play I'd been expecting since Jonas warned me about Cassian's investigative research into my business. He was asking me to voluntarily provide the money he'd already stolen, framing it as family solidarity rather than extortion. How much money are we talking about? I asked. $50 million would probably cover the immediate obligations and legal costs. I know it's a significant amount, but you'd be protecting your own inheritance as well as everyone else's. If the federal investigation forces liquidation of family assets, we all lose everything. The number was precisely what Matthias Drelin had estimated as the total exposure across all of Cassian's failing investments. He'd done his homework and knew exactly how much money would be required to make his problems disappear, at least temporarily. That's a lot of money to ask for over the phone, I said. Of course. We should meet in person to discuss the details. I can have my attorneys prepare loan documents that would give you security interests in the family properties, plus returns that would make this very profitable for you long-term. The offer was superficially attractive, structured to sound like a legitimate business opportunity rather than ransom payment for my stolen inheritance. If I'd actually been the struggling entrepreneur he believed me to be, I might have been, tempted by the promise of high returns and family approval. Let me think about it, I said, ending the call. Leander had been listening to my side of the conversation, and he was already taking notes on a legal pad. He's going to claim you were negotiating in bad faith if this call gets introduced as evidence. Let him, I replied. The recordings of his other calls to family members show the same pattern of manipulation. He's not negotiating. He's running a con game with people who don't realize their marks. My phone buzzed with another text, this time from Elena. Second wave of filings complete. Criminal referrals submitted to federal prosecutor. Press conference scheduled for 2 p.m. The press conference would transform the legal proceedings from a private family dispute into a public scandal. Elena had coordinated with the federal prosecutor's office to announce the charges in a way that would maximize protection for the pension fund beneficiaries while ensuring Cassian couldn't manipulate public opinion through selective media leaks. Are you ready for what comes next? Leander asked. Once this becomes public, there's no going back. The Ciltron name is going to be associated with fraud and pension fund theft for years. I thought about the thousands of teachers, firefighters, and municipal employees whose retirement security had been jeopardized by Cassian's schemes. They'd trusted professional fund managers to safeguard their futures, and those managers had been deceived by a sophisticated fraudster who'd used family relationships as camouflage for criminal activity. The name was already damaged, I said. We're just making sure the damage gets assigned to the right person. At exactly 2 p.m., I stood in the back of a crowded federal building press room, watching Elena address a room full of reporters and camera crews. The questions came rapidly, focusing on the scope of the fraud, the amount of money involved, and the potential impact on pension beneficiaries. This case represents a systematic pattern of securities fraud, wire fraud, and fiduciary violations that spans multiple years and jurisdictions, Elena said into a cluster of microphones. The defendant used his position of trust within a prominent family to obtain access to institutional investment funds, which he then diverted for personal use while providing false reports to investors about the performance of their holdings. Ciao. Reporter from the financial press asked about the pension fund exposure. Elena's response was measured but damning. Multiple municipal employee retirement systems invested approximately $40 million in projects controlled by the defendant. Those investments are now subject to recovery proceedings as part of the criminal case. Another reporter asked about family member involvement. Several relatives of the defendant were victimized by the same fraudulent schemes that affected institutional investors, Elena replied. They are cooperating with federal investigators and will be treated as witnesses rather than defendants. I slipped out of the press room before the questions turned to speculation about my own role in the case. The strategy called for maintaining my anonymity as long as possible, allowing Cassian to continue believing he might convince me to provide financial assistance right up until the moment he was arrested. That moment came sooner than expected. My phone rang as I was driving back to Leander's office, and Kyla's voice was breathless with excitement. They got him, she said. FBI agents arrested Cassian at his office 15 minutes ago. The whole thing was on the news. I pulled into a parking garage and called up a news website on my phone. The headline read, Ciltron family heir arrested in pension fund fraud scheme. Below, it was a photograph of Cassian in handcuffs, being led from his office building by federal agents while reporters shouted questions he couldn't answer. The image was perfect justice for the man who'd built his career on public appearances and carefully crafted impressions. His arrest would be broadcast on every financial news program, shared across social media, and archived in databases that would associate his name with fraud forever. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, but I recognized the writing style immediately. It was Cassian, probably using someone else's phone from whatever holding facility he'd been taken to. You did this. I know it was you. This isn't over. I deleted the message without responding. He was right that I'd orchestrated his downfall, but he was wrong about it not being over. The federal case would take months to resolve, but the asset freezes and restraining orders had already accomplished the primary objective. The stolen money would be recovered, the pension funds would be made whole, and the family members he'd manipulated would finally receive their rightful inheritances. As for Cassian himself, he would spend the next several years learning that criminal justice system doesn't negotiate with people who steal retirement money from teachers and firefighters. The family protection he'd relied on for so long wouldn't extend to federal prison. I drove toward the financial district, where Jonas was coordinating with pension fund managers to ensure the asset recovery process protected beneficiary interests. Tomorrow, we would begin the complex work of unwinding Cassian's schemes and rebuilding trust in institutions he'd corrupted through his greed. But tonight, I had one more stop to make. The open bar at Belmont Estate, where this all began, was about to become mine, along with everything else Cassian had built on stolen foundations. The struggling entrepreneur he'd mocked was about to show 300 wedding guests what real power looked like when it was earned rather than inherited. The marble steps of the federal courthouse gleamed under the early morning sun as I approached, the building where Cassian Veylor would face his arraignment hearing. 3 weeks had passed since his arrest. 3 weeks during which the full scope of his financial crimes had been methodically exposed in court filings that read like a masterclass in corporate fraud and family betrayal. I wore a navy suit that projected quiet authority without ostentation, carrying a leather briefcase that contained documents I hoped I wouldn't need to use. The media circus surrounding the case had attracted reporters from every major financial publication, their cameras trained on the courthouse entrance where Cassian would soon make his first public appearance since being taken into custody. Elena Draycott met me at the security checkpoint, her expression mixing professional satisfaction with genuine concern for what was about to unfold. "Are you sure you want to be here for this?" she asked as we made our way through the metal detectors. "The arraignment is largely procedural. The real confrontation will come during the asset forfeiture hearings next month." "I need to see his face when he realizes who orchestrated this," I replied. 3 weeks in federal holding might have given him time to figure out that his downfall wasn't random bad luck. The courtroom was packed with victims, investigators, and family members who'd been drawn into the legal proceedings as witnesses or co-victims. I spotted Kyla sitting with Uncle Adrian in the third row, both of them looking like they'd aged years in the past month, as the full extent of Cassian's manipulation became clear through evidence disclosure. Jonas Merrick occupied a seat near the front, surrounded by pension fund attorneys who were monitoring the proceedings to ensure their clients' interests remained protected throughout the asset recovery process. The municipal employees whose retirement security had been jeopardized deserved to see justice being administered, even if they couldn't understand all the legal complexities involved. At exactly 9 a.m., a side door opened, and Cassian was led into the courtroom by federal marshals. The transformation was startling. The confident, charismatic man who delivered devastating toasts at family gatherings had been replaced by someone who looked hollow and diminished, his expensive suit wrinkled from 3 weeks of federal detention. His eyes swept across the courtroom, cataloging faces like he was trying to understand how so many people he'd trusted had turned against him. When his gaze reached me sitting calmly in the gallery, his expression shifted from confusion to recognition to something approaching rage. The federal prosecutor, a stern woman in her 40s named Diana Thornwell, stood to address the judge about the charges being filed. "Your Honor, the defendant stands accused of securities fraud, wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to defraud institutional investors of approximately $43 million over a period of 3 years." She continued reading the charges in the methodical tone that transformed human greed and betrayal into precise legal categories. Each count carried potential prison sentences that would add up to decades behind bars if Cassian was convicted, on all charges. "How does the defendant plead?" Judge Harrison asked. Cassian's attorney, a high-priced criminal defense lawyer who'd probably been hired with the last of his liquid assets, spoke for his client. "Not guilty on all counts, Your Honor." The plea was expected, but hearing it delivered in Cassian's presence made the denial seem pathetically delusional. The evidence against him was overwhelming, documented in bank records, recorded phone calls, and testimony from family members who'd trusted him with their financial futures. Judge Harrison addressed the question of bail, and Diana Thornwell argued forcefully against release. "The defendant has demonstrated a pattern of moving assets offshore to avoid creditor claims," she said. "He poses both a flight risk and a danger to the ongoing asset recovery efforts that are essential to protecting victim interests." Cassian's attorney countered with arguments about his community ties and family responsibilities, but the judge's expression suggested he was unimpressed by appeals to family loyalty from someone accused of systematically defrauding his relatives. "Bail is denied," Judge Harrison ruled. "The defendant will remain in federal custody pending trial." The gavel's sound echoed through the courtroom with the finality of a door slamming shut. Cassian's face went pale as the marshals prepared to escort him back to his holding cell, but before they could move, he turned toward the gallery and spoke directly to me. "This is your doing, isn't it?" His voice carried across the courtroom, drawing attention from reporters and court officers. "You're the one who turned everyone against me." Judge Harrison's gavel came down sharply. "The defendant will refrain from addressing the gallery," but Cassian wasn't finished. "She's not the victim everyone thinks she is," he said, his voice rising with desperation. "Check her business records. Look at where her money really comes from. She's been hiding assets, just like she's accusing me of doing." The accusation was his final play, an attempt to drag me down with him by suggesting I was guilty of the same crimes he'd been charged with. It was pathetic and transparent, but it was also exactly what I'd expected him to try. Diana Thornwell was on her feet immediately. "Your Honor, the defendant's outburst is clearly an attempt to intimidate a witness in this case. Ms. Siltron has been cooperating fully with federal investigators, and her financial records have been thoroughly reviewed." I stood up in the gallery, meeting Cassian's eyes directly. "Your Honor, may I address the court?" Judge Harrison looked surprised but nodded. "Briefly, Ms. Siltron." I moved to the front of the courtroom, close enough to see the confusion and fury warring in Cassian's expression. "Your Honor, the defendant is correct that I played a role in exposing his crimes. When I discovered that he'd stolen my inheritance and was using stolen money to prop up fraudulent investments that threatened pension fund beneficiaries, I felt morally obligated to cooperate with law enforcement." The courtroom was completely silent as I continued. "The defendant seems surprised that the family members he systematically defrauded would work together to seek justice. Perhaps he believed that shame would keep us quiet, or that family loyalty would protect him from consequences." I turned to face Cassian directly. What he didn't understand is that real family loyalty means protecting innocent people from predators, even when those predators happen to be relatives. Cassian's attorney was pulling at his arm, trying to get him to stop staring at me and focus on the legal proceedings. But Cassian seemed transfixed by the realization that I'd orchestrated his downfall with the same methodical precision he'd used to steal from his family. "You destroyed everything," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "No," I replied calmly. "You destroyed everything. I just made sure the destruction was properly documented." Judge Harrison's gavel came down again, harder this time. "That's enough. Marshals, please escort the defendant out." As Cassian was led away, he kept looking back at me with an expression that mixed hatred with something approaching respect. He finally understood that the struggling entrepreneur he'd publicly humiliated possessed resources and capabilities he'd never suspected. The courtroom began to empty, but I remained seated for several minutes, processing what had just occurred. The confrontation I'd been anticipating for weeks had been brief but decisive. Cassian now knew that I'd been the architect of his legal destruction, and that knowledge would torment him far more effectively than any revenge I might have plotted. Elena approached as I gathered my things. "How do you feel?" "Like justice is finally being served," I replied. "But this is just the beginning. The real work starts with the asset forfeiture hearings." Jonas joined us as we left the courtroom. "The pension fund managers want to thank you personally," he said. "Without your cooperation, recovery of their investments would have been nearly impossible." "They don't need to thank me. They just need to get their money back." Outside the courthouse, reporters were waiting with questions about my role in the Yas case and the impact on the Siltron family's business empire. I'd prepared a brief statement that focused on protecting victim interests rather than personal vindication. The most important thing is ensuring. 6 months after Cassian's arraignment, I stood in the same marble ballroom of Belmont Estate where he'd delivered his devastating toast about my being the struggling one who still believes in fairy tales. The space looked identical to that evening, with crystal chandeliers casting golden light across polished floors and pristine white linens. but everything else had fundamentally changed. This time, I wasn't relegated to a corner table near the exit. I stood at the head of the room, addressing 300 guests who represented the new order I'd built from the wreckage of Cassian's criminal empire. The occasion was the first annual shareholders' meeting of the Siltran Recovery Foundation, the nonprofit organization I'd established to manage the assets seized from Cassian's fraudulent schemes and ensure they benefited the victims he'd betrayed. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, my voice carrying easily across the ballroom without the aid of a microphone. "We gather tonight to celebrate not just financial recovery, but the restoration of trust in institutions that should never have been corrupted by personal greed." The audience included pension fund managers whose retirees would now receive full benefits, family members who'd recovered their stolen inheritances, and federal prosecutors who'd successfully convicted Cassian on 17 separate felony counts. His sentencing hearing was scheduled for next month, with prosecutors seeking the maximum penalty of 25 years in federal prison. Kyla sat at the head table, wearing the confident expression of someone who'd discovered her own strength through adversity. She now served as the foundation's executive director, overseeing the distribution of recovered assets and ensuring that future generations of family members would never again be vulnerable to the kind of manipulation Cassian had perfected. "The financial recovery exceeded our most optimistic projections," I continued, clicking to a presentation slide that showed the foundation's accomplishments. $47 million in assets have been recovered and distributed to victims, including full restoration of pension fund investments and complete reimbursement of family trust funds that were illegally diverted. Applause filled the ballroom, but it was the respectful appreciation of people who understood the complexity of what had been accomplished, rather than the polite social noise that had accompanied Cassian's cruel jokes. These guests had earned their seats through suffering, cooperation with law enforcement, and commitment to ensuring similar crimes could never happen again. Uncle Adrian rose from his seat, looking older but more dignified than he had during the years when Cassian controlled family decisions. "On behalf of everyone whose lives were disrupted by these crimes," he said, "I want to thank Vera for having the courage to expose the truth when the rest of us were too intimidated or too trusting to ask the right questions." The thanks were generous but unnecessary. What I'd done wasn't courage. It was simply the logical response to discovering that someone was stealing from pensioners and calling it family protection. The real courage had come from relatives like Kyla who'd agreed to testify against their own family member, knowing it would tear apart relationships they'd valued their entire lives. "The Foundation's work is just beginning," I said, advancing to the next slide. "We're establishing new governance structures for family business entities that will prevent any individual from accumulating the kind of unchecked power that enabled these crimes." The governance reforms were comprehensive, requiring independent oversight of all major financial decisions, mandatory disclosure of potential conflicts of interest, and regular auditing by firms with no family connections. Future generations of Siltran relatives would inherit wealth, but they wouldn't inherit the ability to steal from each other with legal impunity. My phone buzzed with a text message, and I glanced down to see a note from Elena Draycott. "Cassian's attorney filed another appeal motion. Denied within 2 hours. He's running out of legal options." The appeals had been predictable, desperate attempts to overturn a conviction that had been based on overwhelming physical evidence and witness testimony from his own victims. Each failed motion only emphasized how thoroughly his criminal empire had been documented and how impossible it would be for him to escape accountability. After the formal presentation, guests moved toward the bar area where servers were offering premium champagne and top-shelf liquor. The irony wasn't lost on me that this was the same bar where Cassian had expected me to quietly accept my humiliation 6 months ago, before learning that the struggling entrepreneur he'd mocked possessed resources that dwarfed his own. Jonas Merrick approached with a champagne flute, his expression mixing professional satisfaction with personal relief. The pension fund managers wanted me to tell you that their boards voted unanimously to name you to their investment oversight committees, he said. They figure anyone who can expose fraud this sophisticated probably has insights that would help them avoid similar problems in the future. The offers were flattering, but I'd already decided to focus my attention on preventing, rather than prosecuting financial crimes. The technology consulting company I'd built was expanding into forensic accounting and corporate security, helping family businesses establish governance structures that would protect them from internal predators. There's something else you should know, Jonas continued, lowering his voice. Cassian's been trying to contact family members from prison, claiming he has information about your business activities that could embarrass you if it became public. The threat was pathetic, but predictable. Even facing decades in federal prison, Cassian couldn't accept that his downfall had been earned through his own criminal behavior. He was still trying to manipulate family relationships and manufacture leverage against people who'd moved beyond his reach. What kind of information? I asked, though I suspected the answer would be disappointing. Nothing substantial. He's been telling anyone who'll listen that your technology company must be involved in illegal activities because legitimate businesses don't generate the kind of returns you've achieved. He seems genuinely unable to understand that ethical companies can be more profitable than criminal schemes. The accusation revealed more about Cassian's mindset than about my business practices. He'd spent so many years associating wealth with corruption that he couldn't comprehend someone building genuine value through honest work and intelligent strategy. His worldview required successful people to be criminals, because admitting otherwise would force him to acknowledge that his own crimes had been choices rather than necessities. Lyra approached our conversation, looking radiant and peaceful in a way she hadn't during her wedding planning when family tensions had been simmering beneath the surface. Her husband had played a crucial role in the investigation, using his forensic accounting expertise to trace the complex money movements that had hidden Cassian's fraud for years. "I wanted to thank you again," she said, embracing me warmly. "I know the timing was terrible, having all this legal drama overshadow the wedding, but I'm grateful it happened when it did. If Cassian had succeeded in moving more money offshore, the pension fund victims might never have recovered anything." Her gratitude was touching, but I sometimes wondered if she fully understood how close her wedding had come to providing cover for the final phase of a massive theft. Cassian's toast about my being the struggling one had been timed to coincide with trust fund diversions that would have been nearly impossible to reverse if they'd been completed. "Have you heard anything about when he might be eligible for parole?" Lyra asked. "Federal sentences don't offer early parole for financial crimes," I replied. "If he serves the minimum sentence the prosecutors are seeking, he'll be in his 60s when he's released. More likely, he'll spend the rest of his productive adult life in prison." The harsh reality of his situation was beginning to sink in. For family members who'd grown up believing that Siltron name provided protection from serious consequences. Cassian was learning that federal judges don't care about family connections when pensioners have been defrauded, and federal prison doesn't offer the kind of comfortable accommodations he'd enjoyed throughout his privileged life. As the evening wound down, I found myself standing on the same marble terrace where Elena Draycott had first approached me, with evidence of Cassian's crimes. The harbor lights twinkled in the distance, and the sounds of the reception filtered through the glass doors behind me, creating a sense of peaceful completion that had been absent from that earlier, more desperate evening. My phone rang, showing a call from Leander Corvin. "I wanted to give you an update on the final asset distributions," he said. "The last of the pension fund transfers were completed this afternoon, and every family member who lost inheritance money has received full restitution plus interest. What about the ongoing business operations? The receivership court approved your management proposal for the legitimate business entities. You now have operational control of approximately $200 million in assets, all of them cleaned of any connection to Cassian's criminal activities." The transformation was complete. The struggling entrepreneur who'd been publicly humiliated, for believing in fairy tales now controlled an empire that was larger and more ethically managed than anything Cassian had ever built. The difference was that my empire had been earned through competence and integrity, rather than theft and manipulation. "There's one more thing," Leander continued. "The Belmont Estate Management Company contacted me about purchasing the venue, outright. Apparently, they're impressed by how smoothly tonight's event was organized, and they think you'd be an ideal owner." I looked back through the glass doors at the ballroom where my family's story had taken such a dramatic turn. Owning the venue where Cassian had delivered his devastating toast would provide a certain poetic justice, but more importantly, it would ensure that future events held there would be organized by someone who understood the difference between celebration and humiliation. "Make the offer," I said, "but I want to add a condition to the purchase agreement." "What kind of condition?" "The main ballroom gets renamed the Accountability Hall. I want anyone who rents the space for corporate events or family gatherings to be reminded that actions have consequences, even when they're disguised as entertainment." As I ended the call and returned to the reception, I reflected on how completely the power dynamics had shifted since that evening 6 months ago. Cassian's attempt to publicly establish his dominance over the family's younger generation had instead triggered an investigation that exposed his criminal empire and transferred control to the very people he'd tried to marginalize. The struggling one who still believed in fairy tales had learned that some fairy tales do come true, especially when they're powered by forensic accounting and federal prosecutors rather than magic wands and fairy godmothers. Sometimes the best revenge isn't served cold, it's served with court documents, asset seizure orders, and a 25-year prison sentence for the person who thought family loyalty would protect them from the consequences of their greed. Dechi, open bar I'd promised to buy in the introduction, had become something far more valuable. Complete control over the family's financial future and the permanent power to ensure that no one would ever again mistake kindness for weakness or ethical behavior for naivety. The fairy tale had ended exactly as it should have, with justice prevailing and the struggling one writing the final chapter of everyone else's story. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.